For a government that promised stability, sound money and economic growth, the reality has really been quite different. Stagnation, uncertainty and higher tax. Now, to be fair, it was a difficult inheritance. When New Labour came to power in 1997, the economy was doing really quite well. Growth was strong, unemployment falling and debt heading down. But 2024 was a very different story. Many years of wage and economic growth stagnation, debt rising, and a huge backlog of underfunded public services and liabilities. To cap it all, the outgoing Conservative government had pushed through pre-election tax cuts the economy could ill afford. A key element of the Labour manifesto was a promise not to raise taxes on working people, reduce debt over the Parliament, and increase government spending on health, public sector pay and investment. It was a simple offer, but one based on faulty arithmetic. The only hope to achieve this impossible trinity of high spending, lower deficits and no tax rises was the kind of economic growth last seen in the 1990s. Because of a deficit and Labour's own fiscal rules, the November 2024 budget ended up being the second largest tax rising budget on record. But in trying to stick to their manifesto pledge not to tax working people, the government arguably picked the wrong taxes to raise. The biggest change was increasing employer national insurance to 15%. It sounded quite clever, tax businesses, not workers. But in practice, it raised the cost of hiring, and combined with weak demand and rising minimum wages, it pushed up labour costs and contributed to a small but still noticeable rise in unemployment. These tax rises, together with higher wages, new global tariffs and surging energy bills, reignited inflation back up to 3.8%. And this rise in inflation created two big problems. Firstly, the Bank of England became reluctant to cut interest rates, leaving the UK with some of the highest borrowing costs in the G7, slowing down the economy even further. And secondly, it kept bond yields relatively high, making government debt more expensive to service and tightening the very fiscal squeeze Labour had promised to escape. This is debt interest payments for the UK, now the third highest share of government spending. Now, whilst some problems are beyond Labour's control, perhaps its biggest mistake has been creating uncertainty over tax and spending. After the big tax rises last November, the Chancellor promised there would be no more. But few believed it, because with such a small budget headroom, even a slight slowdown in growth or higher inflation can throw the numbers off course. And that's exactly what happened. U-turns on winter fuel and welfare reform have only added to the speculation about future tax rises, and this uncertainty is as damaging as the tax rises themselves. People are holding back from the housing market and cutting spending, waiting to see what happens in the next budget. And it's a vicious cycle. Tax rises and uncertainty weaken economic growth, which makes the Chancellor's job even harder. More than anything, what appears to be missing is a clear long-term strategy, a sense of direction beyond just managing the next crisis. Labour often talks about the need to boost growth, but as many governments have discovered, saying it is much easier than delivering it. Now, relaxing planning rules to encourage house building was a positive step, and the OBR even upgraded its GDP forecast by 0.2% by 2030 as a result. But since then, the bill has actually been watered down, another sign of the government pulled in different directions. The OBR also noted that higher public investment could help growth a little bit, yet on the flip side, a rising tax burden risks crowding out private investment. Overall, the OBR judged Labour's spring statement would lift GDP by just 0.2% by 2029, the kind of number that barely registers outside rounding errors. And by the way, talking of missed opportunities, the OBR score rejoining the single market and customs union as a significant boost to GDP. But despite Brexit's unpopularity and a clear loss of potential GDP, this was never really on the table. Now, a reasonable critique is that despite a big majority, the government have largely squandered the momentum of a big win. For example, in an effort to balance the budget, they went for small, salami-sized efforts to improve the nation's finance. means testing winter fuel was probably their most famous policy. It caused a huge drop in support. Yet the big irony is that at best it might have saved 1.5 billion, a drop in the ocean compared to government spending of over 2.5 trillion. It's the same with inheritance tax changes on farm. There was a logic to targeting the very wealthy who use land to avoid tax, but by pushing farmers into the crossfire, they managed to alienate two very powerful groups. Farmers and pensioners definitely vote. And at the same time, they did very little to shift the budget situation anyway. Now, in a different world, they would have gone into the last election saying they would have to increase income tax from say 20p to 21p. They probably still would have won, but this measure would have raised £8.4 billion. And £8.4 billion is more than the combined savings of winter fuel, inheritance tax on farmers, and even removing the 2-child cap limit on child benefits, which is arguably contributing to child poverty. The thing is, you can make unpopular choices if you're very clear, do it quickly, and do it decisively. But if you're hamstrung by bad manifesto commitments, you end up keep alienating important groups of voters. But without ever really addressing the budget issues, you kind of get the worst of both worlds. And then on top of that, there is a persistent long-term weakness of the economy. And the reasons for that go back many years. The OBR have gamely been predicting UK productivity will pick up, yet the economy reliably fails to deliver. And with the OBR finally getting round to downgrading productivity, the budget balancing act has got even harder. And this requires even more tax rises or spending cuts that the government are reluctant to contemplate. And while the government keeps talking about growth, many businesses say new regulations are actually holding it back. Landlords argue the new rental reform bill makes letting property less attractive, risking lower supply and higher rents. The government's target of building 350,000 homes a year sounds ambitious and has largely been welcomed, but developers are only cautiously increasing output. A raft of new rules, many inherited from a previous government, have pushed up construction costs and slowed down projects. In the labour market, the higher minimum wage is a clear win for lower income workers, but it also risks reducing demand for younger workers and squeezing pay differentials across the board. Another major problem for the UK economy is energy costs. Industrial users pay some of the highest in the world, and household bills remain the second highest in Europe. And despite falling oil and gas prices, UK energy costs keep going up. Now, this isn't a new phenomenon. It reflects decades of past policy decisions: privatisation, underinvestment in nuclear, rising transmission costs, an energy mix that leaves consumers paying subsidies for almost every form of generation. It's a problem 20 years in the making. But so far, the government have passed up real reform options like regional pricing, fairer carbon levies, or doing something to reduce prices for consumers. Now, there is a general sense of malaise and disappointment and pessimism about the economy. But you could argue it is all exaggerated by a media environment who perhaps enjoy blaming the current Labour government for decades of accumulated problems. The Financial Times recently argued the UK economy was not a disaster, just a bit boring. Growth is very weak, but it is marginally positive. Unemployment is still relatively low by historical trends. Inflation should, hopefully, come down in the coming months. Confidence is low, but personal finances are in a slightly better position, helped by a rise in the savings ratio and some real wage growth in recent years. And in truth, Labour's impact on the economy, for better or for worse, has perhaps been smaller than some suggest. The economy is more like a vast ship carried by deep ocean currents, and governments can only steer part of the way. But it is a good idea if you have a captain who knows where you're going. Now, Labour will also claim that any achievement never gets reported. This could include improved cooperation with Europe, an effort to harmonise regulations, a national wealth fund, over $7 billion of public investment to co-finance green industry, replacing the apprenticeship levy with more flexible training schemes, an uplift in pay for public sector workers after years of falling behind, real NHS spending increasing slightly faster than the last government. But you can't avoid the conclusion that any of these even small nuggets of good news is generally buried in the general noise of talk over rising tax and black holes. So at this stage, what can Labour do? Well, if you're going to break manifesto commitments, it's better to get it out of the way and do it in a decisive way. You have to get out of a situation where there's this constant speculation about the next tax rise. And if there is more headroom than expected, you can even cut taxes nearer the election. But also one thing I haven't had a chance to do in this video is have Labour made life difficult for themselves by accepting the economic consensus on fiscal rules and Bank of England independence. Is there not a better way to manage the economy? Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments and do subscribe. Thanks for watching.